get this out of my head into the universe as it is, and I will tell you about my model of the universe and how I think about it. I've watched a lot of YouTube videos. I've been thinking about this since I was in high school, basically, in some form or another. And it all comes down to me believing that the universe is essentially made of one kind of structure, one fundamental kind of objects, if you will. And I refer to these as flugens, coming from the term fluid genesis. Basically, the world is composed of these discrete objects and how they operate at their most fundamental level. I almost think of them mathematically, or as a software developer would think of them, kind of like data structures. But in reality, they carry math. They carry math with them. They carry mass with them. So basically, I see the universe as being completely connected, and I see it as being quantized. So everything in the universe is an integer. You measure it, and it is an integer. And even though this contradicts a lot of how physicists and mathematicians think about the universe, and using large fractions for everything, or repeating decimals and that kind of stuff, and the number pi. If calling pi a number is even the right term. But basically, the operation of the universe is comprised of two things. One, a series of vertices, and these vertices connect links together, a collection of vertices, collection of links connected to a single vertex is what I would call flugen. So there are flugen links, flugen vertices. The network of links creates the universe, basically, and it's a huge network, which I refer to as the flugen web. All particles are manifest within this web, in the connections between elements in the web, in the structures. So just to give you some basic definitions here, there's a link in the description that put you to a Google Doc, which has this information written out. If you want to look at that. But basically, basic definitions, flugen links have a mass of exactly 1. Units are hearts, I'll call them hearts. Flugen links have a length of exactly 1, and that length is equal to the Planck length. Flugen links cannot be created, decomposed, or destroyed. Conservation of mass and energy. It's the interesting way in which these connect, that energy is imparted upon a network or a single vertice as a factor of mass, thus generating that mass energy equivalency of E equals mc squared. Now, the vertices themselves do not have mass. They do not have size. They basically have information about the links that they connect, and each vertice has at least 3 links connected to it. It's these vertices that cause movement of energy through the web, because they are managing the connections between the flugen links, which actually do contain the mass. So by moving the mass between vertices, you are essentially moving energy. The vertices are the cause of causality, or the source of causality. Vertices are the source of causality in the universe. Flugen links, the edges within the network, always connect exactly to flugen vertices. Flugen links are always orthogonally oriented to all other links connected to a flugen vertex. Now, think about this. You have 2 connected, they're orthogonal. Well, that's 2 space, right? To a vertex. 3, is a 3 space. 4, where does that go? Well, that's the 4th dimension. Then you're adding more orthogonal directions. And that's basically defining a series of spatial dimensions by this linking structure. The count of links emanating from a Phlegian vertex is the Phlegian vertex dimensionality, which raises the question, how many dimensions are there? Well, I'd say 10. Hey, there's someone looking at it. How did that person even find it? Anonymous Panda. Maybe you found the link is out there. Spatial dimensions. Okay. Interestingly, the count of Phlegian links from a vertex define its dimensionality. The count of Phlegian links emanating from a Phlegian vertex is also the vertex's energy level. The count of Phlegian links emanating from a Phlegian vertex is also the vertex's impulse cadence. And impulse cadence is an interesting thing I'll get to in just a second. The dimensionality, energy level, and impulse cadence of a Phlegian vertex are equal, measured in pose. So all three of these emergent behaviors or properties, if you will, of a Phlegian vertex with its links are really the same thing, but can be thought of in 3 different ways: dimensionality, energy level, and impulse cadence. And you'll see that in a moment how that all works. From the perspective of an individual Phlegian vertex, spatial dimensions are unidirectional, where the Phlegian link is the origin. This goes back to the concept that while the universe is integer, it also does not have any true negatives. It doesn't even have 0. It's all positive counting numbers is how I'm trying to represent things. From the perspective of an individual Phlegian link, spatial dimensions are bidirectionally terminated by exactly 2 Phlegian vertices, which means that one link connects to 2 vertices. It's always connected to 2 vertices and only 2 vertices. The number of Phlegian links emanating from a Phlegian vertex is the Phlegian's vertex dimensional density, which goes back to the number of dimensions that it has, its energy level, and its impulse cadence. But the dimensional density is hinting at the next fact here, there's an upper bound on a Phlegian's vertex dimensional density, meaning that this is exhibited in black holes, and you start to get new behavior when you start getting at the dimensional maximum, dimensional density maximum, where you start having wormhole type behaviors. Every Phlegian vertex has an energy flow cadence called the Phlegian impulse. Now this, I'll get into this in a minute, this is where causality comes into the universe, is this cadence impulse. Think of it as kind of a click, 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 tick, tick, tick. Phlegian vertices connected to only 2 Phlegian links have a quantized impulse frequency of 2, measured in Leonards. Phlegian vertices, because there are 2 quantized links connected to a vertice, you get 2 impulses. It's basically like in a role-playing game, you get a certain amount of initiative and certain amount of actions that you can perform in a turn, if you will. The turn is defined by the number of links to you. That gives you how many impulses you get to perform per turn. Exactly one Phlegian link connected to a Phlegian vertex is twitched, and this is twitched by a Phlegian impulse. So that's sort of the clock going tick, tick, tick. But it's 1 twitch per link, per turn. The Phlegian link is disconnected from a twitch source when it's hit by a Phlegian impulse. Then it's immediately connected to a Phlegian vertex. So it disconnects from a vertex, reconnects to a vertex, but that's an instantaneous action. There's no time between the disconnect and connect. You can think of it as the Phlegians are next to each other and it just switches. It's it's almost like a logical memory reassignment in a program where, this memory location has your address, your GUID, and now this other one has it. It's an atomic operation in terms of the universe. There's nothing in between. It's here or it's there. It's not both. Collision links can connect to the twitch source or another vertex. So when you twitch, you can go right back or you can go someplace else. Now, going right back looks like nothing happened, but it did. There's always a twitch there that something is happening. Either you're connecting here or you're connecting there. And the reason that you could go back to where you were is what's the spatial density of neighboring fusions. And neighboring is an interesting concept. I tend to want to think of this in three dimensionals, but it's not. It's sort of like we don't know what the underlying structure of the Flugen network is, such that a Flugen on the other side of the universe could be in the three space sense right here. And that's what we talk about wormholes and that thing, connecting distant points. But it's only at this quantum foam level, or beneath the quantum foam level, honestly, that these connections touch. So, and there's a mathematical relationship of distance and likelihood of being neighboring, three space distance with likeliness of being next to a particle in n space, whatever n is you choose. So the higher the n, the less probable it is that it's near in three space sense, or two space sense, or one space sense, whatever one space is. So Flugen links, though, regarding neighbors, are more likely to connect to a Flugen vertex in the lowest available energy state. So if there has the options, and it really isn't a choice, it's just an action, it's going to go to wherever the lower energy is, which may be back where it started. Flugen vertex energy levels can be altered only by an integer quantity, which is a consequence of the link carrying one mass, which is an energy of one and a dimension of one, so it has to be an integer quantity. If multiple Flugen edges links are being transposed in the same instant, well, they don't. The impulses go off per link, so it's like the turn-based thing. But anyway, multiple can happen per a phase, if you will. Flugen vertices that gain link connections increase their impulse frequency, which goes back to the concept that density and mass and impulse frequency, cadence are all the same thing, essentially. Ultimately, though, Flugen sequence is quantized. There's a term called Flugen sequence, which is a quantized series of Flugen impulses. Call it an observation, if you will, of a series of actions happening at the Flugen level. And you can say that there is a sequence to them. You started from A, you went to B, you went to C within this configuration. But ultimately, causality, the C and E equals mc squared, is a consequence of the quantized nature of Flugen sequence. So the ticking of the clock, you don't want to call it a clock. It's not a clock. It's simply sequence. It's simply a pulsation, a cadence, a periodicity. Periodicity implies time. It's not time. It's just not time. It's just the gears, the freedom comes and goes according to the links, according to the dimensionality. So when we talk about time, I throw time away as a dimension. I throw time away, classical time away as a dimension. I throw classical time away as a real thing from the most fundamental part of the universe. I treat it as a psychological thing, where when we measure things, we have something called a clock, which is a standardized macroscopic sequence, a ticking, a substance, a mass, a temperature, a pressure, an initial frame, fields, whatever you want to say could be acting upon that. But we take the account of events of some substance, some material, some mechanism, and we say that count versus the count of what we're actually trying to measure. That's what a clock does. We call that ticking a time, but it's really just a sequence in the same way that a Flugen sequence is a sequence. It is not a dimension. It is not reversible in any way. You can go around the loop and come back to a state that looks like you used to have it, but that is not reversing time. That is just recreating a state. So it's very important that you don't think in those terms. We talk about space-time being warped. It's simply space that is warped. We see time effects in the clock sense of time. We see time effects, but those are more an engineer's view of the universe, not the view that you need to understand the underlying Phlegian behaviors. So, all right. So now you got all these little network edges at vertices ticking away, passing links back and forth, which is changing the position of mass relative to other positions of mass. What do these actually do? Well, ultimately, they create a series of vortices are developed within the web itself. And what a vortex is a self-propagating pattern of energy flows, which going back to Lord Kelvin's idea, create knots in the fabric of the Phlegian web on an n-dimensional basis, with degrees of freedom corresponding to those n dimensions that actually exist and that actually are used. And when those dimensions curl, the math of spinors is most appropriate here. What's the other thing that's appropriate? Oh, not theory and spinors. So basically, the Phlegians, the flow is what creates the structure, which is what creates the flow. It's self-referential, if you will, self-reinforcing. And there is modality to it because of the integer nature of the Phlegians and how they cooperate within these networks, that there's a bounded range in chaos theory where you can upper bound and a lower bound at which the number of Phlegians that are participating are sufficient to sustain and define a particle, such as a neutrino or an electron or protons, all the way up to protons. And part of any given particle is not just the Phlegians themselves translating within the structure that they define. It's also the Phlegians that are bounding that participate in it. So I often ask people, where is the edge of a cloud? You could say, oh, it's where the refractive index of the water molecule is going to cause it to look white or gray or whatever. Well, okay, but right beyond that, there's another water molecule that isn't quite in that state or hasn't gone and globbed onto any other molecules and hasn't formed that droplet or that ice crystal. But it's really participating in the cloud itself because it could be incorporated or it could have been just released from the cloud and gone in and out of that state. So the cloud isn't just the cloud, it's the humidity, the crystal, the ice, the temperature, the pressure around that body of air which contains that moisture. And so to say that the cloud is just that thing that I see is an engineering perspective of the cloud, in my opinion, or the way I would describe it, in my opinion. Whereas the real cloud is everywhere. One cloud isn't just that cloud, it's the entire atmosphere and the ocean and the land and even out into space. But it gets more and more diffuse the further away that you get and the further the immediate influence is. So we think in human terms. Human terms are engineering terms. And that's what we say. So, but when you take another example is, why doesn't a tornado, this 400 mile an hour vortex within the atmosphere, why doesn't it blow apart immediately? You got 400 miles an hour of energy going in every single direction around there. Well, it's because it's in an envelope of quiet or still, relatively still atmosphere, and there's creates these little eddies all around, like ball bearings, that allow it to keep reflecting, bouncing off of that outer envelope, and maintaining its structure. Well, that's exactly how any particle works, except it's much more multidimensional, and it's happening through this product of linking and unlinking of flugens within a pattern, a knot, a spinner defined model, um, within space itself. So the reality is that everything from a black hole, a galaxy, galactic filaments, um, planets, humans, BBs, atoms, molecules, and everything is a consequence of these structures being set up by the flugens themselves, being self-referential. When you start composing these things into different structures as opposed to just being free, you end up creating atoms, for instance, where you've got neutrons and protons packed together. Or it's even more interesting, or not more interesting, simple neutron proton, right? It's an electron and a muon or whatever. It's a neutron with a proton. So that's the difference. And there's a bounded structure that is different for a proton versus a muon that is very small, and it takes that mass of an electron to make a neutron and change the structure of a proton, or when it decays, it drops down and throws that away and becomes a proton. But they're bounded, but they have, the numbers we're talking about are so hard for me to think of how many flugens are in an electron versus a proton. The mass tells you the multiplier, but the number that you start out with for an electron is enormous when you're talking about Planck length things that are in operation within an electron. And I don't have the math. I'm not a mathematician, so I'm just thinking of this logically and building up a structure of one thing upon another here. But basically, but when you start, this goes back to why space. This is where fields come from, right? Where, like the tornado in the atmosphere, the field that contains it is the atmosphere itself, the still air, and the little ball bearing micro counter rotating vortices that form around a tornado cone. The same thing happens in the nucleus of an atom. So when a proton is there, it has this is the proton. It has this area of strong influence around it, which is actually warped web, which when you put it, if you can just take a neutron and go, hey, here you go, it's going to actually cause that to snap across the two and become a single shell. Well, neutrons and protons, they don't want to go together, but once you get through that activation energy, you're basically forcing springs to mesh. And that's not a very clean metaphor, but I think you get the idea, is that they snap together once you force them enough. But it's like when you're, what would be a good analogy? You're using Legos or something. You're trying to jam them together in a way that they wouldn't want to have. They have to unfold a degree in order to receive each other. And that's why, as you get larger and larger atoms, they become more and more unstable, because the perturbations in this structure now starts to become more diffuse and more diffuse. And you eventually end up having the vibrational energy within the atom, within the nucleus of the atom, be enough that with this right perturbation from the outside, passing neutrino might be enough, or cosmic ray, that's pretty violent. But anyway, it could be enough that in a given inertial state, in a given temperature, it will be enough to cause a neutron to decay into a proton, just thus change the element. Or in the manifestation of charge and of magnetic field and electric field, which are probably the same thing. There's just different angles on the same thing. Those create these inertial frames of reference into which this area around the field, I don't want to call it a field because it's really a spatial structure that is suited for the parking of electrons. So the electrons, they fit right into those shells. I love the shell analogy. I think of it almost, two dimensions as little gullies, if you will, around the atom, but then you turn them into three-dimensional gullies. And when the electron gets there, it changes its structure. It's interesting. It has two structural forms. One is smeared within a shell, so it has no place, and you call it waveform. I don't think of it in terms of waves. I think of it in terms of a stepped leader phenomena, which I'll get to in a minute. But basically what the electron does is it smears into the shell and occupies that state. And so when a shell is filled, you don't have any more room, but there's another one out here and it will smear. And they sort of are spirally connected between each other. The spinner of the nucleus is what's creating those in and out paths into the shells as to smear the electrons. And it's so cool that when they go around, it's just form this little envelope. And there's different, because it's n-dimensional, the same envelope has multiple complementary paths of which an electron can smear. So there's inertia in the electron, and I think it is sort of, it really is a bubble within a shell, but the dimensionality allows multiple electrons to be at the same energy level and dimensionally spinning in different directions, and thus the spin balance and all of that. And when a photon enters the nucleus of an atom, or not the nucleus, when the photon enters an atom, it interferes with that structure, and it can it causes an electron to jump state because that photon is sitting in there perturbing one of the shells, and it doesn't fill it, but it gets trapped in the bubble here. So two things have to happen. It has to enter, it has to perturb, which causes this one to smear up here, and at which point when it smears, the photon is smeared, and it gets trapped in between shells, basically, which is really neat. But then, obviously, it can be freed and come back out and re-radiate at a different energy level and a different frequency, right? So just the way you see that, and the way that the photon works and the way that the electron works are all these propagations of these Flugian vertices being linked and unlinked, linked and unlinked, linked and unlinked in this sequence around here. Now, I see all phenomena within the universe as being connected and are subject to stepped leader behavior. And this is where wave particle duality is actually, how wave particle duality is actually explained. Stepped leader being the phenomena of lightning in a cloud seeking a ground source. So channels within the atmosphere form that are really, I'm a computer scientist, so it's like a kind of path searching algorithm from both sources where you're branching exploration from the ground up and from the cloud down. And once there's a connection made, all of that energy that was doing that seeking channels back down to the step leaders and across. And if you view an electron as having that behavior, the idea of the two-slit experiment can actually be kind of elegantly explained in my view. The observation matters. Single slit, it acts like BBs. Through two slits, it acts like an interference pattern, right? Well, what's really interfering is not probability. It's this stepped leader that everything in the universe is producing. That's part of its field. I mean, I think this is what the Poynting field is really an expression of, is that's how energy is transmitted through a wire. You have the energy field being a stepped leader that is formed, basically facilitated by that wire. The structure of the wire provides the mechanism to precede a stepped leader channel for the energy to go through. And then when you start pumping electrons in one direction or the other, that channel of energy actually goes back and forth through the wire in and out, alternating current or direct current, depending on if you want to go one way. How you want to fight resistance and superconducting and all of that becomes another interesting thing when you start cooling atoms and groups down to superconductive level. Again, you're creating a channel in which the Poynting vector, where the energy is coming through space, is not seen. There's so many things we don't see, but we are able to use as engineers. Humans are engineers. Humans are always engineers. We use what we understand, and then we treat it as reality, when in reality it's just empirical, or empirical is probably the best way to put it. Experiential. It's how we experience reality at our scale. It's interesting that humans are somewhere in between the very small and the very big. So we can sort of look both ways with equal ignorance, if you will. But anyway, so the stepped leader phenomena exhibits itself everywhere. As I said before, it is the essence of fields. So I'm getting a little wound up here, so I'm going to let this go right now. Oh, and I want to tell you about gravity. I love gravity. It's my favorite thing to tell people about with this. I'll tell you right now. I'll have a minute. Here's how gravity works. Every particle within the universe is an object with a significant amount of mass, which means that the Phlegon vertices have a higher density of Phlegon links than in free space, intergalactic or space, where we have nothing but the vacuum of space and the quantum foam intrinsic within it. So a massive object, let's say a planet, for instance, it's got a lot of particles, which is the matter, the atoms that comprise the planet itself. So basically, and going back to this idea that every particle is not just the surface of the particle, not just this little field around it, but it's everything else. It's the idea, this is why space is pulled, stretched, or pulled inward to a massive object. It's this bundling, this tightening of the links around a vertice. And what happens on a massive object, let's take a planet, is that you have a density gradient of how packed the dimensional density of the individual Phlegon links or at vertices is higher. And it's higher the closer you get to the center of mass. And it might actually invert slightly at the very center, but let's just take the surface of the Earth and then go in. So you have shells of density. And what happens is since energy is transmitted by the fluctuations of the Phlegon cadence, of the transitions of the Phlegon links between vertices, Phlegon vertices, that means that within a quiet, even a cold world at near absolute zero, there's a cadence going, There's greater density, so there's more action at a lower level, closer to the center of mass is lower. There's more action here than here. This action has a tug. Every one of these little tick-tocks between this shell has a tug down, and then there's a greater tug down, but an additive tug is probably a better way to put it. But it's the square. What is it? The square root of the distance is the amount of force. So basically, and it makes sense because it's spatially shells that are of a certain volume, which contain a certain amount of flugens. And the more mass that there is in that object, the more of these links there are, and the more the shells, these ticks going towards the thing, pull. They have a tug. They always have a tug, and it tugs everything into the center. So it's almost like those illustrations where they show you the flat space, and then you put a massive object and you get this gravity well. Well, that assumes that there's some gravity way down on the floor here that's pulling everything down this spiral. When in reality, what it is shells of density, and as you get in there, the tug of the cadence of the Flugen web itself, as induced by these density shells, creates a net force down. So it's almost like it goes up instead of down, and the upwardsness of it is what actually brings you together. But it's all because space itself is being compressed, contracted, pulled together, gathered, bunched to some limit. And at some point, you take this and you end up with this incredible machine called a black hole, which is now going to tug everything to the point where it rips the structure of it apart and just throws the links into itself, and they basically gather at the highest possible density in the universe. And we'll get into what happens when you have too much mass. There is a point at which a black hole, and where black hole evaporation comes from. All right. I got myself wound up here. I wish I had someone to actually talk to, an interview, or have interview me, as opposed to just speak this out. But redshift, that's a good one. Vacuum energy. This should be with a Y. Magnetism. Haven't even gotten to that yet. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for today. Thanks for looking. Bye.